about maybe 15 people here and 35 people on WebEx. And as I understand it, they can hear me quite well. I don't know if they'll be able to hear you guys.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
Can you turn the camera around so we can see who's in your audience?
Sure.
Hi, everybody. Yay. Good to see people again.
That's great. How great is that?
Good to see you.
Hooray.
Okay.
That's great.
Hello, hello.
There's Kate.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay. Good. Okay. So welcome everyone to our first in-person DMICE conference of the pandemic of 2022 and I guess of 2021. I always thought that when we would have the first conference that I would want to be the first one to present. So I took advantage of my status and anointed myself the first speaker. But I hope that other people will speak this way. And, you know, things are looking pretty good. I'm ever the optimist. David Dorr jokes that, you know, I get paid the big bucks as department chair to be optimistic. I actually don't get paid that big of bucks, but anyways, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to continue moving in this direction. And then I thought, well, okay, if I'm going to give a talk, what do I want to talk about? Some of you may have seen this article that was published late last year. I was really enamored by it. So enamored, actually, I've had a number of emails with the author and have been encouraging him to actually keep it up to date. And one of the things that I really like about this article is that, well, a few things. You know, one is that, you know, we've been saying for a long time now, you know, machine learning, AI is going to impact medicine. And this article is a systematic review that attempts to look at what is actually true and not true in that regard. And another thing that I like about this article, and I'll show you this in my rudimentary PowerPoint graphics, is that it actually covers all aspects of DMICE because we have clinical informatics, so implementing this in clinical settings. We have BCB, all the hardcore data science, machine learning modeling, and so forth, and clinical epidemiology that doesn't participate a real lot. I was actually hoping that maybe some folks might come, but the folks up on the 5th floor, or well, they mostly work remote these days, who do systematic reviews and publish them in the literature. And so this really encapsulates all three of these. And so I have, I don't have a, hey, come on in. I don't have a massive number of slides here. I deliberately wanted to keep this a little on the short side. Also for some discussion, because I actually think that DMICE is really well poised to, you know, carry on and contribute in this way of making some of the newer advances in machine learning, deep learning, and all that clinical reality, benefiting patients. And so, so my last slide is conclusions, but it's actually questions, and it's not my conclusions because I hope there will be some interaction with the audience. We'll see how well that works in our somewhat updated, although all the cables here are still those, all the video cables are still the old style VGA, but anyway, supposedly he told me that's going to be upgraded. So let me go ahead and get started. Oh, I guess I didn't introduce myself since I usually introduce the speakers, but everyone knows me. But if you're out there and you don't, I am Bill Hersh. I'm the chair of DMICE and the director of the Biomedical Informatics Graduate Program. And actually, I've put these slides on my website. I actually meant to send them out by Twitter beforehand, and I was changing things at the last minute, so I didn't do that. And so again, hopefully there'll be some time for discussion. So let's see if we can get the, okay. So we're back to the office somewhat. So in-person classes, those that have been scheduled to be in person will be. And, of course, many of our health and clinical informatics courses are online, so those will continue in that manner. The fellows meeting, which I plan to attend today, and will also be in person. This conference, when the speakers are willing to do as I'm doing today, they can speak in person. We streamed this conference for years before the pandemic. We will continue to do that, and that will allow more people to participate. And in fact, hopefully with better technology, it might be a little bit more interactive than it used to be, of people having to, when there were microphones on the table, push the button and all that other stuff. So we'll see how that works. If nothing else, the speaker will need to stream as always. I do want to tell everyone that as of now, unlike the last 2 years, we are planning to have graduation. Well, OHSU is planning to have graduation. As always, DMICE will be there. We always are. I pull out my regalia. The last couple of years, I've had to put it on at home and stand in front of a camera, including, as some of you know, 2 years ago when my daughter graduated medical school. We actually got a picture of myself, her, and the dean on my screen talking. And apparently the dean loved that picture so much, she actually showed it in her State of the School address that year. Anyways, we also used to have a banquet, and we're planning to do that this year. Lynn will be working on the details. It will probably be the Saturday night before graduation, which will take place on Sunday, June 5th. I will be there. I've only missed one graduation in the 20 or so years we've had graduates, because the NIH insisted that I come to a project meeting that unfortunately conflicted with graduation. But every other year I've been there. So faculty are welcome now to start returning to the office. Most people, like myself, plan to do so 1 or 2 days a week. I've actually been coming in on a number of Mondays, and I will continue that, and probably on Thursdays as well. And of course, we're all very accessible by the usual means. Our office staff will be returning to the office later, but they're also, again, very accessible by email and other means. If you're like me, you may follow the COVID statistics. I guess it's being blocked by the WebEx thing. But OHSU has, I don't know if you've seen the OHSU COVID response website, but we're down now to 4 patients in the hospital at OHSU, which really, I remember a couple months ago was almost 100. And so we're making progress. Now we know that there's the BA2 variant and so forth, but hopefully we'll stay at that level. So then that gets back, that gets to the next question about what about wearing masks. Wearing masks is optional. I still do it sometimes when I'm in really crowded settings. Well, everyone theoretically is at least vaccinated twice, hopefully everyone 3. Actually, because of my age, I'm actually eligible for a 4th one starting next week, which I will probably do. I think the data is pretty impressive. So masks are optional, but certainly if people ever ask me to do so, I will do so. So having a low threshold for wearing a mask. So, okay, well, let me go on to my talk. So one kind of tagline for the talk could be AI meets EBM, evidence-based medicine. Or another one might be, we need to be doing AI beyond data wrangling and modeling. That's fun. Many of us like to do it. But if we really are true to the principles of biomedical informatics, we want to provide clinical value. So I'm going to give a little kind of level setting background, because some of you may know a ton about machine learning and very little about evidence-based medicine, or vice versa. And again, I was hoping maybe there's some of the folks on the WebEx from the clinical epi side of the department. So what this, so that will, I'll do that first. I will then discuss this paper. I will go through some of the results. Disclaimer, I've done this a number of times already. We, as some of you know, we have colleagues in Argentina they invited me to their annual informatics conference this past November. Unfortunately, it was virtual because Argentina is a great place to visit, which we used to do so. But I actually gave a similar version of this talk without all the extra DMICE stuff. But so the systematic review looks at the clinical impact and quality of randomized controlled trials involving interventions evaluating AI prediction tools. And then some discussion, really mostly open-ended discussion at the end about clinical evaluation of AI. Is that something that we can or should be doing? So, whoops. I guess I can't really, I can move these things like that. Excuse me. So as you know, there's three parts to DMICE. There are the clinical epidemiology folks that do evidence-based medicine and systematic reviews upstairs. There are health and clinical informatics, which I consider myself to be most closely aligned with, focused on clinical informatics systems, applied AI and machine learning, and of course, bioinformatics and computational, actually that should be biomedicine, sorry, that do a lot of the omics work and a lot of the deep diving into data science. And there obviously is overlap. I was trying to decide how to draw that Venn diagram to look most effective. But the notion is that we can all converge at that center piece there, and that is DMICE. Do it here. Okay, so this talk will address a topic at this intersection of the three areas of DMICE. So we'll talk about a systematic review that could have been done. In fact, some of us in this room have done systematic reviews of informatics related topics, myself included. So that's clinical epi folks. Looking at the clinical aspects of predictive AI tools, so those of us in HCIN, and then applying data science and machine learning, which is some in HCIN, but also definitely in BCB. So here's one bit of level setting around clinical epidemiology and evidence-based medicine, perhaps for some of the BCB folks, although maybe they know all this already. So evidence-based medicine, EBM, many of us involved on the clinical side know that that's applying the best evidence for making clinical decisions. And probably the best reference is what's now called the Strauss book, was originally the Sackett book that was written by David Sackett back starting in the 1990s, yeah. And it was called the Sackett book, but Sackett, actually, unfortunately, he's passed away, but he retired a number of years ago, and Sharon Strauss is now the lead editor. So EBM, evidence-based medicine, prefers experimental studies, so studies where we actually manipulate things to see if something works better than something else. But we can use observational studies, which are studies where we don't manipulate things experimentally, but we do observations that are making the best use of data. So clinicians have many questions, but they generally fall into four categories, and each of these four categories has different types of what's considered to be the best evidence, the best kind of study. So when we're talking about treatment or even preventive measures, the best study is a randomized controlled trial where we take a population of people who are similar and we randomize them into one group or the other. And we read about randomized controlled trials in the news now with vaccines, with new COVID treatments and so forth. That randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for experimental determination of whether a treatment or a vaccine or something works, or a diet or anything else that we do. When we may have a question about diagnosis, actually a lot of clinical predictive tools, including these AI tools, are looking to essentially make a diagnosis. For example, a machine learning algorithm that's interpreting chest x-rays. So we typically do some comparison with the gold standard. And with machine learning, we do training data and test data, maybe with cross-validation, to try to see what is the best method that works generally. Another big question is harm. Does something cause disease, whether it's a virus or an environmental exposure, toxin, or something like that, or something that we use to treat disease and makes people better, but also causes harm. The best way to study that actually would be a randomized controlled trial, but it's usually not ethical to do that for something that's harmful. So we use things like cohort and case control studies, which I won't go into, but those are the kinds of studies that we look at. And then finally, questions of prognosis. And there we use prospective cohort studies. So for all of these studies types, when there are a sufficient number of studies that are similar enough to each other, we can do a systematic review. Which means we ask a focused question and pull in all the evidence, all the studies. And that's what a lot of the folks in the clinical epi side of the department do. A few years ago, I was involved with the study actually on telemedicine, before telemedicine was actually really widely used. And our main conclusion was that it's barely used. That's not the case anymore since the pandemic. And if these studies are very homogeneous, for example, 18 studies of the same drug to treat COVID or high blood pressure, whatever, we can actually do a meta-analysis where we combine all the data as if it's a single study, which increases statistical power. In terms of if there are any of the clinical epi folks who are less familiar with informatics, but certainly, so this is another bit of level setting. Let me see where we are time-wise. I'm going a little slower than I had hoped. So level setting around. Whoa. Watch is talking to me. Sorry. So one of the major activities of clinical informatics is applying AI to patient care. And some of us in this room are old enough to have experienced the first generation of AI that started with people like Ted Shortliff. That was his PhD dissertation at Stanford in the, I think it was the early 1970s. And the first generation of AI was very different than the AI we do now. There was the development of handcrafted knowledge bases, so coming up with all the rules or tables, however we were going to do that, and then writing computer programs that would work on those rules or tables or whatever. And of course, some of us can also remember when computers didn't have the kind of power of my watch to start telling me where I am, or GUIs. Actually, the internet's been around a long time, but the real robust high-speed internet. And in fact, the whole kind of first generation of AI was not scalable. And there was what some people call the AI winter starting around the late 1980s, which was actually right at the time that I started my NLM fellowship, just like many of you. And in fact, my interest in information retrieval came about in part because I saw the whole AI, first generation AI world kind of collapsing under its own weight. And actually, I mean, people even stopped using, when people started using the term AI again about 5 or 10 years ago, oh, I remember that term. Anyways, but now, of course, AI is the big thing. It's had its resurgence in the 21st century, and it's really being driven by machine learning and especially some of the advances in deep learning. Machine learning actually, and even neural nets existed back in the 20th century when I was an NLM fellow. But again, we didn't have the data, we didn't have the computational power, so there were very small, some would say toy systems. But by you know, the 2010s or the aughts, the 2000s, now we were getting large amounts of data, both generally and in medicine, electronic health records, digital images, things like that. And then also having plentiful computer power to process them. And some of then the development of deep learning methods, which many of you in this room know more about than I do, have really led to impressive capabilities, classifying images, classifying EKGs, classifying things out of medical records and so forth. So we've made a lot of progress in that regard, but actually, as of 2022, we can ask the few folks in the room who see patients, the AI doesn't impact their clinical practice much yet. And so that's because we need these next steps of turning, taking the the models and their results, and finding ways to show that they actually improve clinical care. So that brings us to data science and machine learning. There's a ton of literature out there, but data science in essence being the science of learning from data. I love this quote from this guy Donahoe, that a data scientist is a person who's better at statistics than any software engineer and better at software engineering than any statistician. So you kind of need both to do data science. And in fact, some of us in informatics have had angst around the term data science, and is that different from informatics? It's also impacted the statistics field. They're kind of grappling with, do we do statistics or data science? Anyways, but the big achievements have been machine learning, which is attributed to Arthur Samuel in 1959, which is a year after I was born. A field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And that describes what machine learning does, and especially deep learning. And I actually have a PDF of this talk that is on my website, and I can send the link around. There have been some, Eric Topol, who was the keynote speaker at last fall's AMIA meeting, has written a lot. He wrote a book in 2019. Raj Parkar, I can't remember his first name, published a paper this year that is a nice kind of overview of where we are and where we need to go. I think it was published in JAMA, the medical journal. And then we have this diagram, which some of you have seen me show before. It comes from our friend Philip Payne, just pointing out that there really is a cycle. And one side of the cycle is where we go from the real world to our knowledge about it. And he calls this the afferent process and afferent processes. And data science plays a big role here, although many people in informatics do this kind of work too. But where informatics really differs from data science is in the efferent loop, where we go from applying knowledge back to the real world. And that's where some of the other things that we do in informatics that are listed here: evaluation, implementation science, organizational theory, human-computer interaction, workflow, et cetera. So it's a big happy world, and hopefully we can loop this cycle and have things like machine learning and deep learning provide care to patients. Okay, so let us ask then, what is the evidence for the benefit of AI? I guess it took me almost 20 minutes to get here. So we think in evidence-based medicine. We want to look at experimental interventions, whether they're treatment or prevention, probably coming from randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials, just like any other kind of research, can be done poorly. So there are best practices for doing them, so they should be well conducted. Their results should be generalizable and well reported. And it's really weird that someone is talking and should be muting themselves, even though I'm sitting here in this in-person conference. Whoever is talking, please mute yourself. There are other questions that we could ask and answer about AI. One's, again, about diagnosis, harm, and prognosis. But ultimately, we have to demonstrate that they benefit someone, patients, clinicians, populations, and so forth. And so that's what led to this systematic review by a team from a university in China, who I probably should have put it on here, but I didn't. I just have the reference. This is an open access article, so anyone can go get it and read it. Again, I've had some emails with the first author who's been very helpful. He actually sent me some data. But what this systematic review is looking at is what are the randomized control trials evaluating interventions using AI prediction tools. And it was published in NPJ Digital Medicine, which is part of the Nature publishing group. They did what the EPC folks do upstairs. They did a broad literature search. You'll see some details of it. And they basically lumped the randomized control trials they found into three categories, which I think is reasonable. One are the traditional statistical methods that we don't typically associate with machine learning, even though there is some learning going on there. There are then the kind of classic machine learning networks, machine learning methods. And then there are deep learning systems that use complex neural networks. And so what they found in general was that the first two categories, I'll call them TS and ML, focused on a variety of things they were used for assistive treatment decisions, so making decisions about treatments to use, assistive diagnosis, helping to make diagnosis, and also risk stratification. We often in medicine do risk stratification to decide if someone is at risk for something, and that may lead us to intervene more so. All of the randomized controlled trials of deep learning, and there's only 11 of them, have focused on assistive diagnosis, which is not surprising. And most of them focus on imaging. So keep going. Okay, so if you've ever read a systematic review, basically what you do is a very broad literature search. You go to something like PubMed. They've actually published as an appendix this long literature search that they did. I think it was pretty good. Usually the, at least the systematic reviews that are done here, they involve library staff who are very knowledgeable about using retrieval systems. And so they found 26,000 articles in the literature, and that's not surprising. And in fact, that's fairly common in a systematic review. They removed duplicates, they screened the records, but then because they were looking for randomized controlled trials, they quickly got down to a tiny number. And so what you do in a systematic review is you screen the abstracts. Sometimes the articles don't have abstracts, so you can only go with the title. You can't read the full text of every article. But they did pull out 95 full text articles that had were potentially randomized controlled trials of AI tools. And of those 95 95 articles, they identified 65 randomized controlled trials from 63 articles. Sometimes an article will have more than one trial. Those were included in the analysis. And they also were looking, I won't talk about it much, but observational validation studies. So studies that validated some of the algorithms that were studied in these, the algorithms that were used. Okay, I'm going to have to keep moving the WebEx stuff. It's okay. So, so they identified 65 randomized controlled trials. So this is a table that unfortunately I probably could have made it larger. It's probably not that visible. So I will just highlight some of the findings in the table. So of these 65 trials, 61%, 40 of 25 had positive results. So, so when there's a positive result, that means there was some benefit shown for the AI. So you can be a glass half full or empty kind of person. You can say, wait a second, that means 38.5% of the trials did not have positive results. That's not uncommon when something goes from the laboratory, the bench, to the real world. And we can still learn things when a trial is not positive. Hello, sorry. They looked, one other thing about positive trials, we need to be careful. Sometimes people look at, well, what is the number of positive trials? Does that mean that something is effective? That's actually not necessarily a good thing because the trials are not uniformly distributed over all the kinds of questions that we would ask. So the number 61% positive trials is important to know, but it isn't like the analysis stops at that point. They looked at the disease categories that these tools were applied to. Cancer was fairly high, especially the imaging studies. other chronic diseases, acute diseases, primary care. Excuse me. The type of algorithms, there were more traditional statistical than machine learning, than distance learning, than deep learning, sorry, probably because of the age. Statistical tools have been used a lot longer than machine learning, and those methods have been used a lot longer than deep learning. And they looked at the predictive tool function. I mentioned this before. The most studies have been done on assistive treatment decisions, more so than assistive diagnosis and more so than risk stratification. Here's an issue, though, that came up, and this is something that happens in all clinical studies, not just ones of AI. There were some concerns of what they call, risk of bias. If we do a study perfectly, then its risk of bias should be small. But if there are things that we do, such as not using the consort statement, which is a checklist of all the things you're supposed to do in a properly conducted randomized controlled trial, over 50% of the studies didn't use the consort statement. 3/4 of the studies had no masking, so the people applying the AI tool knew that they were applying it. That can bias studies. That's why it works best with pharmaceuticals, but that's why we give patients placebos, so that neither the clinicians nor the patient know the drug that they're getting, unless they get certain effects from it. But for the most part, that's the purpose of doing a double-blind randomized controlled trial. A number of studies did not use intent to treat analysis. So when you're doing a study, a randomized controlled trial, you should be analyzed in the group that you were assigned to, even if you end up crossing over. So like in a surgical trial, you may end up needing surgery, but if you got randomized to the non-surgical group, your data should be analyzed with that group. And then a lot of these studies didn't provide details of their study protocol. So let me move on. So move the WebEx windows around again. So there's another table that looked at the characteristics by tool type. And so you see, you should be able to see that a little bit, the traditional statistical tools, the machine learning tools, and the deep learning tools. And they kind of sliced and diced. I won't go through everything on the slide, but one interesting finding was that almost all the traditional statistical and machine learning tools use clinical quantitative data, so basically structured data out of electronic health records. Not surprising, most of the deep learning studies used images. And another interesting finding, actually kind of hard for someone who does research with free text, narrative text, is that I think only 2 studies actually tried to use text in the machine learning models. And there's big challenges in doing that. And so in terms of disease category, the highly variable for traditional statistical, a lot of the machine learning studies looked at chronic disease, and a lot of the deep learning looked at cancer, again, mainly because they were doing imaging diagnosis. In terms of the results, they were actually more positive for the machine learning and deep learning studies, and kind of mixed for statistical, although again, counting numbers of positive studies is not really the best way to say that some method works better than another one. Okay, so I'm going to just keep moving these. Something we'll have to figure out how to do as people give these talks. So here they looked at studies by year, and there's probably no surprise here. The traditional statistical, although their numbers go up over time, but you don't see the appearance of deep learning studies until the later years, 2019 and 2020, because deep learning is a lot newer. The positive results vary by year. I don't know if there's any conclusions one can draw there. in terms of, actually, and this is an error here, this should actually be type of prediction tool. Positive versus negative, we see that the traditional statistical has about a 50% positivity rate. It's higher for the machine learning studies. That doesn't necessarily mean that machine learning is quote unquote better, but there are more positive studies. Here's where we get to a little bit more detail on some of the risk of bias. So they went through the 65 trials and looked at various factors related to risk of bias. So things like selective reporting, incomplete outcome data, the various kinds of blinding. Another issue is allocation concealment. What that is that you prevent the experimenters from possibly manipulating the allocation. I can remember when I was a medical student, that you used to randomize patients by putting things in envelopes, and people would hold the envelopes up to the light because I really want to get the patient into the experimental group and not the control group. But that's actually undermining your study, because if you get all the sicker patients in the experimental group, then they may just do more poorly and you won't achieve the benefit that you would get if you did truly random allocation. A lot of the studies, it's not that they didn't do these things, is that they didn't report it in their studies. So they may have done some of these sorts of things, but they didn't describe it as well as they should. We can see here that there are concerns about risk of bias, perhaps more so in these traditional statistical studies, but in all of them across the board. And this is just more ways of slicing and dicing the risk of bias. So one actually criticism I would make of this paper, not so much with the data, is that not so much with, the analysis that they did, but of how they presented the data. So, for example, this is, and I wanted to cover these because I thought people would be interested in seeing what kind of deep learning studies were done, because we know that deep learning has been used for many, many things, but almost all of the clinical randomized controlled trials of deep learning have focused on assisting endoscopic procedures, in particular gastrointestinal procedures, so scopes. If you're as old as some of us, you've had these procedures done where they either put a flexible scope down from the top or up from the bottom. And actually there is some, there are some good studies that have shown that if you have a deep learning system there, it helps the endoscopist from missing polyps, things like that should be removed for biopsy. And that's what most of the clinical trials are about. There's one on childhood cataracts that helps to diagnose them and lead to optimal treatment. And most of these studies had positive outcomes. There's another study on out-of-hospital cardiac arrest where they developed a model for an algorithm to assist with diagnosis. And it actually, even though the algorithm worked pretty well, it didn't make a difference in the patient care. The patients in the ambulances to whom it was applied didn't do any better whether they had the predictive algorithm or not. So, so again, my complaint about this is this table is almost unusable other than creating a screen capture of it, which I've done here. But you can look at it in the paper. Well, I'll get to this in a second. But anyway, so this is what we have in the world right now. And this is about a year old now, so maybe there's a few more studies, but 11 clinical trials of deep learning. So we need to do more. And I think there's opportunities for people to do more. What do we conclude about this systematic review? Clearly, these tools show great promise. If you look at all of the modeling studies. The, you know, people have built models now that train, that can read chest x-rays for tuberculosis, for COVID, for pneumonia, as well as radiologists can read electrocardiograms, as well as cardiologists can classify skin lesions as cancerous, as well as dermatologists. So we clearly have a lot of promise for these algorithms, but now how do we actually apply them in clinical studies? And I think that's the next big challenge. And that may be where the world goes beyond the data scientists to the informaticians, the clinicians, and so forth. These trials here in particular also have high indeterminate or high risk of bias. And again, the deep learning studies are very focused on essentially one kind of procedure. So I do have a few concerns about the review. If it had come to me for peer review, which didn't, I might have pointed these out. I actually, the published paper actually has, there's actually a missing column. You go back, I don't know if we can. Anyways, I pointed it out to the author, and he acknowledged that it makes that table I just showed you challenging to use. He actually sent me a revised copy, but I don't think that's made it into the paper yet. That also the table of machine learning interventions is problematic because it's this huge unmanageable PDF that's like basically a printout. You know, it's like someone had a table in Word and printed it, and it's impossible to work with. Actually, the author was nice enough to send me his Excel file, which I have if anyone wants. And as often happens in systematic reviews, there are studies that are either not present or perhaps they were classified wrong. So this study by Winberg.
لانه بياخد الحراره من هون ما بياخدش الحراره من
Oh,
هون.
if someone can mute themselves who's talking, please do so. And then they didn't provide
السيستم بيست
any,
على بيشتغل بيست على الثرمومتر هذا هون.
I don't know who's, is there possible to mute whoever is talking?
They're not, I think they just joined by phone. They need to mute their phone, please.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you for muting. So, and they actually didn't provide a table for the traditional statistical. So it's hard to know, you can't just get a nice overview of those studies and what was done and so forth. So I think there were some aspects of the review that could have been done better. So, anyways, so one may ask, which department is best poised to evaluate these sorts of things? And in fact, if any of you read my blog, I actually wrote this. Actually, this got, when the NIH was preparing this Bridge to AI funding initiative, they had this workshop and they asked people for grand visions. And mine, I called for a grand vision of what I'm talking about here, translational AI. I was one of the 25 that were picked. They didn't, that ended up being completely separate from the funding initiative, which we might get funded with a group that we're involved with. But anyways, you know, I think that, and maybe I probably should have put David Dorr here instead of me, but anyways, DMICE, you know, I think we have the ability to really do all aspects of this work. So instead of stating conclusions, I'm going to ask other people to state the conclusions, and maybe I threw up a few questions, and I talked a little bit longer than I thought I might. What do people conclude from all this? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I don't know if, actually there are some things in the chat. Let's see. And then I can also, oh boy, lots of, save the date for the banquet. The difference between not positive and negative results. Thank you, Mina. That's actually a good point. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Right. Yeah, they did. Now, did the WebEx folks just hear Paul?
No, we
No?
didn't hear the question.
No, we didn't
Okay.
hear the question. Yeah.
They didn't hear the question. Okay, well that, that is something we're gonna have to solve for this room. But Paul, just kind of picking up on the point that Mina made, what are the actual outcomes? If we actually can go back, see if I can go back. If we go back to just looking at the deep learning, they looked at trying to see here, trial outcomes. So for example, this, I'll just pick this first one. So mean blind spot rate. Maybe that's not a real good one. Or the second one, accuracy of diagnosis was an outcome. And when I assume that positive means that the group using the AI tool, in this case, maybe made the diagnosis better, or detected, like this one in the middle here, detected an adenoma better, detected a polyp better, and missed fewer ones. I assume that for the endoscopy ones, they probably video recorded the whole thing. So it's those sorts of things. And I think ultimately the outcomes should be clinical. Can we advise people to use, you should use a deep learning algorithm connected to your endoscopy tool to make sure that you don't miss that polyp or something like that. And then maybe that leads to a cancer being detected earlier with perhaps a better outcome, something like that. Deb Levy makes a very excellent point. As I see that Aaron is here. Aaron and I are trying to get a negative paper published. There's definitely, publication bias, as most of you probably know, is that studies that are positive are more likely to be published. Or what was it that Paul used to say? What is it? Interest, or David Sackett quote. Yeah. So as Paul just said, studies with enthusiasm usually lack control. Study with controls usually lack enthusiasm. It is a challenge in that, and this is not limited to AI. People want to publish positive results. The New England Journal of Medicine wants to be quoted, in the Washington Post tomorrow that, a new study shows that this tool, helps identify cancer earlier and patients have better outcomes. Or, some cases, there was the big ivermectin trial that was published in the New England Journal this week that I think it was really exciting for them to say that there was no benefit. Anyways, but publication bias is definitely a problem. Mina asking observational studies can provide evidence of benefit. Why they chose, I think it's definitely true that observational studies can give us lots of information, but for clinical interventions, the gold standard is a randomized controlled trial. And so that's why the authors, I assume that's why the author is limited to this. Kate saying statements like our study included more AI RCTs than previous reviews, probably true. Okay. Gold standard being experts, that's true, especially in studies of diagnosis. Gold standard, some have said there are truly no gold standards in medicine. There's probably some truth to that. So let me then go back to my In fact, maybe let me stop. Yeah, yeah.
So it seems like some of the so if
Mhm.
you're using it for things like drug discovery, those might then be validated with a more standard
Yeah.
control trial or something like that. So I guess what is your sense of kind of the captured
Yeah.
with this, and then what might be missed by things that are just further upstream,
Sure.
like increasing our understanding of biology that they're to the clinical setting with more standard methods?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And probably since the folks on WebEx didn't hear it, that let's try to rephrase it. There are other benefits of AI that occur further upstream. There are many studies, which I've alluded to, where people have developed models, and we need to do those studies because it's only the models that work that should actually then be used in the randomized controlled trials. Because if the model doesn't work, then you're not really using anything that's known to be beneficial. I think the modeling studies are kind of like the basic science studies that are done, in medical centers. So in the basic science departments here, we have a lot of people who do laboratory studies, tissue culture studies, animal studies,
Couldn't get what?
compounds that are, potentially useful in treating diseases. And we do it with, tissue cultures and animals first before we move to humans. We learn a lot in that process. We learn a lot. We learn about something that might work or something that doesn't work. And then when it does work, it advances upstream, downstream. I don't know which. But yeah. So this no one can or should conclude from this that we should not keep doing. We need to keep doing the modeling studies. We need to keep building the models and testing it with good data sets. And there's a lot of issues about getting the best quality data sets. But that's the basic science work. And that work can also provide insights, so for example, there's I don't know if it made it into this, well, I guess it wasn't a randomized controlled trial, but there have been some studies where they've taken large corpora of medical records and been able to predict deterioration in the hospital, mortality, things like that. Very few of those tools have actually made it to the point where they're actually put in a hospital and someone finds something about a patient and intervenes and does something. But you can still learn a lot from those studies. You can learn about the kinds of the factors that are associated with patients deteriorating in the hospital and so forth. So, it's important to do those kind of studies and then, and have those advance to this level so we can actually see how effective they are. I don't know if that answers the sort of, yeah, Ben. I don't know if those EPIC, I do actually know a fair amount about those EPIC studies. So the vendor of our and many other academic medical centers, EHR system, EPIC, has a bunch of proprietary prediction models. And some of them have been shown to work pretty well, but others have done studies actually showing that they don't work well. And because they're proprietary, they're obtuse, no one knows, why the model didn't work well. I don't, I assume actually if there were randomized controlled trials done using those models, they would probably be in the traditional statistical ones because those models are pretty basic. But as we know from studies that you all and me too are familiar with, those models have not been very transportable. And part of it has to do with, just the real world implementation of EPIC and people not defining the data fields properly, and has actually led to calls for these kinds of models to be much more open and transparent, because we can't, when they, if we have someone saying, use this model, it's in Epic, but if we don't know how it's been validated and so forth, then, that's kind of like using a drug, to treat a disease that we don't know how it's been validated. You're going to say, yeah, yeah,
Trust us that it makes you better. Secrecy, I'll say, right? Doesn't fit very well with the benefit.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Was there another hand up? Yeah, yeah, Chengda.
By looking at the number of models being so there are 27 models already published, and without taking advantage of the models, and because we don't have enough to do the testing validation. So I think much of the work is going from.
Yeah, yeah. So we're talking here about models and some of the limitations. And Chengda is talking about when you said 27, is that for COVID? Yeah, yeah. Someone wrote a paper. I'd have to dig it out, but the data has been so plentiful with COVID that anyone and their brother can create a model and train it, and if it seems to work, publish it. But very few, if any, of those models have been validated in real world settings and actually shown to provide any kind of predictive value for patients, as I read that paper. So let me see. Mustafa has a comment. Let's see if how we can work this. Do you want to unmute yourself and hopefully we can hear you?
Hello. I hope that the folks in the room can hear me. I thought this was an interesting paper, and I was intrigued by the framing of traditional statistical methods versus there's a distinction drawn between machine learning and deep learning. When statistical methods do have a way of doing deep structure, which is structural equation modeling. I didn't see structural equation modeling in the query. I looked up on, and in the paper it said most of the traditional statistical methods were regressions. I looked up PubMed, structural equation model and randomized controlled trial, and I got nearly 500 results. So it just wasn't clear to me that that had been in scope for this paper, and it seems like if it wasn't, it was a bit of an oversight. And I'm also concerned that the framing sort of implies that statistics is of the past and data science is of the future, when in fact there could be a much more vibrant sort of information landscape happening there.
Yeah, I think those are great points. That's why I had wished actually that there was a table like there was for machine learning and deep learning of the traditional statistical. It actually, seeing some of the errors, some of the simple errors that I saw in this paper always raises a concern around how well peer reviewed it was, although NPJ is part of the nature group, so one would think that they would have decent peer review of this, but this is what the peer review process is for. I probably others too have reviewed papers knowing that, pointing out to the authors that there's several papers you missed here, which makes us wonder about your methods for identifying all of them. So that would be interesting to look at. I see some comments from Dr. Vim about the use of deep learning to the endoscopy. I don't know, again, I don't know the details of these particular studies, but you could go look at them. I think that the models were trained, they must have been trained using video of some of these procedures. But then how it actually got applied in the clinical setting, we would have to go in and look at the individual papers.
Yes,
So
Bill, I just look at one article. They are using that real time. I thought it was just experimental, but I'm reading an article that is titled "The Future is Almost Here." So we are using that live during the endoscopy procedure. So yeah, I found an article. Thank you so much for this. I didn't know that this is happening. Thank you so much. I did endoscopy. I'm very much interested in those things. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm actually looking at the time and seeing that we have run over. Sometimes in my enthusiasm, I don't keep an eye on the time. But anyways, I hope actually, obviously there's probably a lot more we can discuss. I hope that this conversation will continue, because I certainly see the benefit of all of the AI research that's going on, and would like to see it in my lifetime actually make a difference clinically. And so hopefully we will see that. So I'm gonna stop at this point and thank everyone for their attention. Thank you.